Okay, well, thank you for the invitation to be here. This is a topic very dear to my heart. I want to start by saying greetings from Australia. Here is a picture of Australia, a photo I took myself in a nearby part of the Australian bush, not more than 10 kilometers, I think, from where I was born, and in the northern area of Sydney. And I do that just to show that I really do come from a long way away, but I'm intensely interested in the kinds of issues you are discussing, and I have learned so much from colleagues in Central Europe over the years. I'm very glad to be able to give something back. I think you are speaking of an extremely important theme, one that matters in people's personal lives, because gender and power relations in gender do affect the way people understand their own lives, how they construct themselves. Gender matters in human relationships, families, peer groups, friendships, and more. And it matters at the macro level too, at the level of governments, economy, institutional life, education. In all of these areas, the issues that you are discussing at this event do matter a lot. Now, when we focus on power, if we look at the pinnacles of power in the world that we live in, it is quite striking how strongly gendered the elite levels of power are. For instance, in economic power, the people who run the transnational corporations, which are the most important, most powerful institutions in the global economy, are overwhelmingly men. In fact, about 95% of the top managers of large transnational corporations are men. If we look at military power, at the armed forces of the world, the concentration of men at the top is even greater. It's something like 99% of the generals in the world are men. If we look at personal fortunes, the hyper-rich oligarchs, the billionaires, again, we're mostly looking at men. If we look at the elite levels of political power, well, here's an example. Here's the group who hold supreme political power in China. This is the central executive of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, the ruling party there. And you can count the number of women who are there. And then if we think of religious organizations, most of the organized religions of the world are basically run by men too. So there is this very significant gendering of elite levels of power. And this is something we're familiar with in most periods of history, going back certainly for thousands of years. And yet this does change even at these levels. And you will be familiar with that in Germany, of course, because of the very significant political power held by Angela Merkel in very recent history. And in Australia, we likewise have had one woman as head of government in recent years, the first in the whole history of settler colonial government in Australia. So although gender patterns are very strongly marked in contexts like this, there is still the possibility of change. And that is an issue that I want to run through all my remarks and come back to right at the end. What I'm planning to talk about in turn is, first of all, how we learn gender and how we encounter power in gender relations. Then I want to go theoretical, if you don't mind that, and reflect on how we understand gender and power in gender. And finally, I want to say some things about youth and change in gender relations. So that's the line of march that I propose to follow. So let me start with how we learn gender and how we encounter power, because they are very closely connected. Children begin to learn gender very early in life, and they learn gender because the people around them in their immediate, usually family contexts, are acting in gendered ways. They are, in the words of sociologists, doing gender from very early in life. Here's one of my favorite images of family life. It is, in fact, a fantasy from the 1950s, an illustration in a very popular women's magazine, Australian women's magazine of the 1950s, showing what was presumed to be a kind of archetypal family scene. Well, we know that this is a fantasy. If you look at the cook in this picture, you will discover that she puts on her pearl earrings to do the cooking, that she cooks in high heels. The family, of course, is, and the people in it are stereotypes in various ways, but they illustrate, nevertheless, a way people think about families, and families very characteristically are thought about in terms of gender division, of the place of the father, the place of the mother, the place of the son versus the place of the daughter, and so on and so forth. So that when children begin to ask, well, where do I belong in the world? One of the earliest answers they can give is where they belong in terms of gender, in terms of gender relations. On the right-hand side of this picture, on the left-hand side of this picture, or in the case of some children, of course, maybe not belonging very well in that picture at all. But it's not just at the level of fantasy that children encounter fantasy and imagination, that children encounter families and the power relations in family. Whenever there is family violence, of course, that is a strongly gendered process. And children learn their place, or the place of people in a gendered world, also through that experience. They learn to recognize forms of affection that are appropriate to women or to men, forms of speech, perhaps, and so on and so forth. So in growing up in family contexts, whether or not they are as stereotyped as this way, will almost always be a way that children encounter gender and begin to encounter power relations in the context of gender. Well, from the family, the normal progression is that children will proceed to schools and spend their time learning and playing in schools in some ways a wider social context than the family. But the schools too are gendered institutions, as I discovered very powerfully early in my research career, when I was involved in research in secondary schools, high schools in Australia, both in ruling class schools and working class schools. A point which is captured nicely in the illustration in the artist's work on the cover of the book that we wrote about that study. As children move through school life, spend time in school and interact, they spend a lot of time in peer relationships. They form peer groups, which also are commonly gender structured, not necessarily gender segregated, but highly conscious, according to the ethnographic evidence, highly conscious of the gendered relations. And so a process of learning begins, which is quite markedly collectivized, involves the children's social learning, involves things that children learn together, because learning is often a highly social process, with learning going on in a number of heads at once. And when researchers have looked very closely at this process of learning about gender in school context and peer group context, two things stand out from that research for me. One is the evidence of children's interest in gender matters. I mean, it's not a case that the adult world, has to, oblige children to concern themselves with gender. Children want to know generally, want to understand. They find this aspect of life generally highly interesting. Areas of exploration, sometimes areas of tension and trouble, but very much of concern to most children as they grow up through childhood and adolescence. The other thing that comes strongly out of the research on children's learning in these contexts is the children's agency in these matters. Learning gender is not just a matter of being socialized, of having gender identities stamped on you, like the stamp on a letter or something like that. Children are busy in learning, and this is, of course, a general point about learning. But children are busy, exploratory, intrigued, and active in learning about gender too. They try out gender positions, gendered practices of one kind or another, whether it ranges from upper primary school children experimenting with lipstick, or engaging in gendered forms of sport. Children are active in the matter, not passive. But however active they are, they're still in a structured environment in schools, and there they encounter, often for the first time, what we might call institutionalized power. That is, the hierarchies in institutions like schools, workplaces, and so forth. So they encounter teachers as holders of power. They're likely to encounter school principals as holders of authority, of some more distant kind of power. Power, in other words, becomes a very common, readily experienced part of the experience of education, of the education system. And so the understanding of gendered power becomes more complex than it might have been just in the context of the family. And of course, there are power relations in peer groups too. There are leaders, there are central people in peer groups, and there are more marginal, there are processes of bullying. I'm sure you're more familiar with this kind of stuff than I am. And then, of course, when the kids leave school and go out into the wider world and the wilder world, whether it's into media context, on to university or directly into the workforce, they're going to encounter gender in more forms again. They will encounter, in fact, from early in childhood, they will encounter mediated gender, representations of gender in mass communications, in entertainment, for instance. Here is a very favorite image from the cover of a collection of French research on masculinities. And you will probably be familiar with the actor involved and the type of stereotype, of course, of gender that Hollywood action movies present to young people. They may, in this context, now encounter real gendered violences, not just imagined violence. They may experience sexual harassment that is, in fact, common in the experience of adolescent girls and some adolescent boys too. And some of them will experience rape directly or here. And we've come to recognize this perhaps more as a result of recent media debates of the publicity of the Me Too movement against sexual harassment. But of course, everyone who's done research on gendered violence will be familiar with the way young people come to know about this side of power. Then when they get into the workforce, young people encounter gender in the form of divisions of labor, but also economic power and economic authority in workplaces. For many young or relatively young people, a key experience on leaving school is, in fact, joblessness, unemployment. And this is not just in countries with advanced capitalist economies. Here is an image of unemployed workers in India lining up for relief payments in this particular context. Structural unemployment is a feature of youth in developing countries. It can be at appalling levels. And even in quite rich countries, it's common for levels of unemployment to be higher among youth than among older people in the workforce. When people get into the workplace, when they actually have a job, of course, they then encounter not just structural power and powerlessness in the form of unemployment, but they encounter direct economic power in the form of bosses, foremen, the controllers of workplaces, and have to find ways of coping with their relative powerlessness in the context of economic organizations. So, I mean, I'm reciting stuff that I'm sure is broadly familiar, but trying to take an overview of that emphasizes how pervasive the experience of gendered power is in different forms as young people grow up. This is an inescapable part of life which they come to in a variety of ways, but which structure their lives and will continue to do, of course, in adulthood, but have to be regarded as a formative part of childhood and adolescence. Okay, I now want to step back a little. Being an academic, I'm concerned with concepts, conceptualization, and theory. So I want to just think a little bit about how we understand gender and how power fits into the model of gender. Because there are models of gender where power is not important. One of those is perhaps the commonest common sense understanding of gender. That is, that gender is simply a natural dichotomy, natural in the very strict sense of being given by nature, given humans reproduce through a system of sexual reproduction, like other mammals, like many flowers, and so forth. There is a distinction between a biological role of males in reproduction, a biological role of females or female functions. But this, although it is important to recognize and understand as part of the terrain of gender, has no capacity to account for the kinds of phenomena I've been talking about before. And there's very strong grounds for taking that view. But equally, gender is not simply a free choice of an identity or a cultural position. It's not something that can be simply separated from bodies. And therefore, I'm equally critical of views of gender which locate it exclusively in people's imaginations, identities, self-images, and the like. That too is part of the meaning of gender, but it's far from being the whole, and it's certainly not able to account for the large social patterns that I've been talking about so far. So we need another way of thinking about gender, which recognizes that it is a social structure, but it's a social structure that is embodied, that necessarily engages our bodies, our sexualities, that has a connection with human reproductive sexuality, though it is not simply determined by our biological makeup. And all that distinctiveness of gender as an embodied social structure means that the way bodies work matters in gender practice. Bodies themselves have, to put it technically, have agency in gendered practice, whether it's sexual arousal, whether it's bodily habits, bodily learning, forms of presentation of the body. Bodies matter, but that doesn't mean, and it's really important to understand this, that does not mean that gender is somehow outside of history because it's embodied. In a way, we can understand gender as how sexual bodies enter history, enter a social process in which social relations are constructed and change. And that makes a very complex process. I'm totally critical of views of gender which make it simply a dichotomy, simply a binary. Gender has never been binary. It is much more complex than that. Embodied gender involves the production of multiple forms of masculinity, multiple forms of femininity, and a whole complex of institutions and relationships which organize our embodied lives, our emotions, our personal relationships, and so forth. So that's the background view of gender that I build on in trying to understand the lives of young people. You'll find my account of this in a book I've written called Gender in World Perspective. This is the latest edition of it in English. There is a German edition of a German translation of an earlier edition. And in that I develop a model of gender, social gender, as having several dimensions, one of which is power. I regard power, therefore, as one of the inescapable, inherent dimensions of gender relations, alongside other dimensions, such as the economic dimension of production and consumption, the symbolic dimension of representation, communication, and the dimension of cathexis, of emotional attachment and repulsion and separation. But in my reading of gender, power is inherent in it. It's not something we can wave away or expect to abolish. Power relations will exist, whether they are highly unequal or relatively equal is up to us collectively. But it's something that is, if you like, an inherent part of the world of gender relations. Now, here I want to warn against an oversimplified view of gender and power, which I might myself have almost implied at the beginning of this talk, when I showed you the picture of the businessman and the Chinese politicians. It is easy to think that power, in some way, is inherently present in men's lives and not in women's, but that would be a mistake. Power is not, equivalent to being male, being a man, or nor is it equivalent to masculinity. There are forms of masculinity which are definitely not powerful, which are subordinated or marginalized. Recent research on masculinity has become increasingly interested in forms of masculinity that are constructed by men and youth who deliberately reject power, who attempt to live in more equal, egalitarian ways with the women and girls in their lives, who are in fact attempting to construct a relatively gender equal gender order for the future. And that seems to me a very promising way of thinking, and something that I will come back to a little later. But it is important, I think, to recognize that the familiar structures of power, what second wave feminists began to call patriarchy, patriarchal power, have been under contestation now for half a century. In fact, for longer historically than that, though we tend to think of that contestation as having begun, say, in the 1960s or 70s. And certainly that was a great increase in contestation then. Here's an image from when I was young and terribly optimistic. This is International Women's Year back in the 1970s, in 1975 to be specific. It's the demonstration in marking the first International Women's Year in 1975, the demonstration in Sydney, my hometown. And that launched, or it didn't launch because the women's movement had been running then for 5 or 6 years. But that was a peak of mobilization of women naming on and contesting patriarchy, and that was to a very significant extent a youth movement. So is gay liberation, not entirely a youth movement, but to a very significant extent. And we've seen that phenomenon again in the so-called third wave or fourth wave of feminism, and in the queer movement that has developed and to some extent critiqued the old forms of gay politics. And again, we see a good deal of youth activism, and I'm delighted, of course, to see it. And these movements over the last half century and more have indeed changed the world. There have been very significant shifts in social life, economic life, laws, as a result of these mobilizations. One of the biggest changes in the world, I think, in my lifetime, has been the rise of literacy among women around the world as a result of massive efforts in girls to increase levels of girls' education and run adult literacy programs for women. That's a huge revolutionary change in global culture. We've also seen professions such as law, medicine, open up to a very significant extent to access for women who, not too long before, historically, had been forbidden to enter those kinds of professions. We've seen very significant moves to the recognition of lesbian and gay lives and rights. Australia, not long ago, voted in favour of gay marriage, and it's not the only country which has moved in that direction. So these originally largely youth movements have had a long-term impact, but of course they've not had it easily. And in not it wasn't too long after those movements arrived that some kind of backlash began to appear. And in very recent years, in the last 10 or 15 years particularly, there has been an upsurge in mobilizations against these movements. There's been a mobilization, for instance, in right-wing Catholic circles against the concept of gender itself, which is claimed to be not only against the order of nature, but against divine models or laws about how humans should be. And there has been a rise, as we all know and worry about, a rise in authoritarian populism around the world, illustrated, for instance, by the Putin regime in Russia. This is a picture of Vladimir Putin actually on his way to Australia some years back, passing an honoured guard when he got off the airplane in Indonesia. I could illustrate that political movement in other ways as well. And you will be aware, I'm sure, of the contestation of women's reproductive bodily rights in various countries of Eastern Europe, the backlash against gay rights and trans rights in the United States, which gets a lot of publicity in the last couple of 2 or 3 years. So, there is an active and not always happy politics around changes in gender relations. This is a highly contested field, and I guess it will remain so. So I want to wind up my talk with a little thinking about youth and youth's role in changing gender relations. Okay, people of my age are staggered at the amount of time that many young people spend on digital media and their skills, their astonishing skills that have given rise to the idea of there being digital natives in a way that we older people cannot match and indeed hardly understand. And there's something in that, of course. The new media have been advocated, have been proclaimed as arenas of freedom, and many young people do use them that way. But the digital media also are arenas for the circulation of very reactionary gender stereotypes. The internet is full of highly stereotyped pornography, for instance, as I'm sure everyone is familiar with. And they also, the new media also become mechanisms of surveillance, which is worth remembering when we are thinking about freedom achieved through digital media. But what matters for me here is that this also can become a notable new arena for activism, for contestation of gender hierarchies, for anti-patriarchal mobilizations. And I've already mentioned one of those, one which has got perhaps more online publicity than anything else, the mobilization, the Me Too, hashtag Me Too mobilization against sexual harassment, which had a very significant impact in Australia, I might say, and in other parts of the world. I want to mention too, that was mainly a mobilization of younger women using digital media as a form of activism. But I want to mention also the significance of new forms of activism for men, young men and boys. This is an image of the flyer for a symposium that happened just last year in Africa, most of it online, some of it in person, which was a global meeting of the Men Engage Alliance. I'm sure some of you are involved in this and others will know about it, but for those who don't, this is an international network of local organizations, mostly NGOs, mostly voluntary organizations, a network of about 600 different organizations around the world, in Latin America, North America, South Asia, Europe, East and Southeast Asia, the Pacific area, are all represented in Men Engage. I was actually one of the speakers at that conference. And that, I think, although anti-sexist work among men and boys can be very difficult, it is to be very encouraging that so many groups in so many different political and cultural contexts have found it worthwhile to attempt that kind of work. There are more intimate, personal forms of politics too. There are negotiations that go on in everyday life. Attempts, for instance, by couples to create what is sometimes called fair families, gender equal families, sharing childcare, sharing paid work, and the like. This also is a form of activism. It may not be very visible publicly, but it does happen in a significant number of families and is, of course, changing the environment in which numbers of children are growing up and their experience of what gender relations can mean, which they will carry forward into other parts of their lives. It is also interesting to me that recent research on men and masculinities has developed a particular interest in what might be called, what are often called hybrid masculinities. Masculinities that are not simply constructed through an opposition to femininity or on the part of heterosexual men through an opposition to homosexual masculinities, but which are constructed by incorporating, if you like, some features which are socially understood to be characteristic of women's lives or gay men's lives and outlook. That is to say, crafting new and more complex forms of masculinity, which at least offer the possibility of more equal gender relations as these patterns of masculinity spread and become more recognized. So as well as the tough messages, the grim pictures that authoritarian politics may encourage us to adopt, I think there are some reasons for optimism, at least for recognizing possibilities of democratic change and more equality in gender relations for the future. We do have, if you like, some liberated zones that are created by, especially by young people in their own lives or online. These are possible. Gender equality can be realized. It is tough then to move from those kinds of experiences, from equal families or equal peer groups, into the world of institutions and economic inequality, where much gender inequality is based, as I was arguing earlier. And that is a strategic issue that I think young activists for change have to address and will be addressing in the future. But the future is possible. We are not stuck in a timeless, unchanging present. So in moving towards the other world that is possible, we need to think of moving from symbolic politics, from politics simply about representation or claims of human rights, to actual organizing of counter-power. And that's the tough part of the recipe. And that, I guess, is where your work will come in, the work of most of the people who are at this conference, in work with youth, which involves enabling them as active citizens and giving them the tools, or helping them gain the tools to understand a gendered world and take a part in changing it. So I wish you well in that work. I hope what I've been able to say has been of interest and perhaps of use. And I would be very happy to answer your comments and questions. Thank you.